Welcome, everyone. This is the Reverend Thom Muller here with my buddy Rudy Caceres. Another episode of Swedenborg Room. Rudy, how you doing?
I'm good. It's episode 4, How Time Flies. And I have been learning more and more through you about the works of Emmanuel Swedenborg, so I appreciate that. We'll keep chugging along on YouTube, so please subscribe and like all the posts and leave comments. It's been great so far, so let's not jinx it.
Exactly,
What are we talking
exactly.
about today, Reverend Thom?
Today, we figured we would talk about a topic very commonly associated with Swedenborg, which is the afterlife.
Yes, something that I know nothing about because I am not dead. So I want
Sure.
to know all there is from beginning to end. Well, I guess not end, but you know what I mean. Again, I'm the novice. I'm sitting under the learning tree, and teach me, Reverend. What should I learn about first?
Well, I guess, those of you who are familiar with Swedenborg, which I figured most of you who are watching this have at the very least Googled Swedenborg, otherwise you probably wouldn't be watching this. The thing that Swedenborg is sort of on a popular level most known for is his claims of having visited, quote unquote, the afterlife, spiritual realms that people inhabit after death, speaking with spirits and angels from those places and recording his experiences, his visions in his theological works. And by far his bestseller is Heaven and Hell, which is not his first work, but it is definitely his most popular work for good reasons. And so a lot of folks who have been drawn to Swedenborg, not everyone, but a lot of people who've been drawn to Swedenborg have been drawn to him because they've resonated with his descriptions of life after death, which he claims come from personal experience.
So we talked a bit about this work in our Works of Swedenborg episode. I think that was episode
Yep.
number 2. So we're going to do a bit of a more of a deep dive and just break it down Barney style, I guess, in the Cliff Notes version of Heaven and Hell, and then we'll do our deep dive into the nitty gritty.
Sure. Are you saying heaven and hell as in that specific book or the theme in general?
You know what? We talked about the book. Let's go into the
Yeah.
theme.
Cool. Yeah. Just to clarify on my end. So Heaven and Hell is not the only work which contains Swedenborg's visions of the afterlife. In
Right.
fact, all of his published theological works have lots of references to communication that he's had with these spiritual entities, right? Right. But if you wanted to sort of get a very basic sort of afterlife 101, heaven and hell after 101 um, description of, if you wanted to have a very basic description of what heaven and hell are like in Swedenborg's visions, I can do that. Something to really bear in mind, and this is opens a can of worms in and of itself. When I say Swedenborg believed or says people who do X, Y, and Z live in X, Y, and Z location, that does not mean that's what I believe. It does not mean that is what the Swedenborgian Church of North America believes. It is simply me trying to accurately describe what Swedenborg believed and what he thought he saw, right? And another thing that's incredibly important, and you alluded to this, I got to sort of open up with this. You alluded to this earlier, which is the question of, is he talking about metaphysical time and space reality, or is his work or his visions allegorical, right?
Right.
And you have people who fall all across the spectrum from, I now know what the afterlife looks like, or I now have an accurate account of what happens after a human being dies, right? All the way to completely psychologizing it, of saying Swedenborg saw these things and they are reflections of his psyche, and possibly more universally speaking of a kind of collective psyche. What Swedenborg, I believe, would say is that it's both. And that's really important to bear in mind, and that they are not mutually exclusive. So when Swedenborg, say, meets an angel, and that angel says, yeah, I'm this person. I used to live in France when I was in my earthly body. Um, he would say that, yes, he is in fact talking to a person that has died that used to live in France. Yet he would also very clearly say that the important thing about the vision that he is seeing is the inner state which that French person represents. right? So
Right.
the question of is this literal or allegorical, we all have to answer ourselves. Swedenborg would say it's both. And very importantly, he says the inner is always more important than the outer. So you might find yourself not at all resonating with the metaphysics of this. Like, say, you believe in reincarnation, right? That's perfectly fine. You can read Swedenborg's descriptions of what he's seeing and how he's interpreting them as an image of what's going on within you. And that is the primary importance of them. That being said, Swedenborg believed that we are all primarily spiritual beings who are living temporarily in this time and space bound body. And that when we die, our inner self, our spiritual self, continues to exist. And it continues to exist in a way, in a state that resonates with where it is comfortable and where it finds its ultimate expression and use. So, in other words, Swedenborg, and not to kind of juxtapose this too much with other systems, right? But when Swedenborg uses the terms heaven and hell, he's not talking about places of punishment or reward. In fact, he's not really talking about places at all. He's talking about spiritual states that we freely inhabit. So let's say if I have made my life here on earth all about being nice to other people and being altruistic, helping other people, X, Y, and Z, that would be a spiritual state Swedenborg would call heavenly. If I've made my life all around being mean to people, being self-centered, being destructive to other people for my own gain, he would call that a hellish state or a hellish love, right? So that's the measure. And he believed that when our physical body dies, we choose to inhabit a realm that resonates with us. So if I'm a quote unquote heavenly person and I'm really into being nice to people, and say you're a horrible human being and you really just love ripping people off, right? I may say that, well, you're in hell, right? That is, but the truth is you would feel that you are in your heaven, because if it is truly your affection, that's where you are. So Swedenborg has these visions of people who are in a hellish state, being able to freely move into a heavenly space, but simply not wanting to because it doesn't resonate. So that's kind of a basic framework of how this works, according to Swedenborg.
Now, like, part of me was always like, I don't want to know what happens in the afterlife. I just want to do my own thing, be a good person, obviously, which it can be interpreted in different ways depending on different moral systems. But
Sure.
what was Swedenborg? Did he was that one of his missions, one of his objectives, to learn about the afterlife? And in your personal opinion, do you feel like it was important for these revelations to become clear? I hesitate to say that. Oh, this was God sending a revelation to Swedenborg to pass on to the masses? In your view, what's going on there?
Yeah, I think again, once again, talking about what Swedenborg believed, yes, I do believe that he believed that these things were metaphysically accurate and that they were inspired, that they were in fact a revelation, right? He believed that he really did have those experiences and they were accurate depictions of what he experienced. Once again, right? But something that's extremely important in Swedenborgian theology, that's very essential, is Swedenborg did not believe that beliefs are salvific. And this is one of the ways in which he very much breaks away from a lot of the more orthodox views of salvation, where there's a question of being saved by faith alone, which is sort of a traditional Protestant approach that was very common in his intellectual milieu at the time, versus the idea of being saved by works, et cetera, et cetera. And what does salvation mean to begin with, right? To Swedenborg, salvation means reunion with the divine. The point really is that to Swedenborg, heaven is a matter of realizing a spiritual state that you are in. It is not somewhere you are sent to. It is not some place that you are punished or rewarded for your behavior at. It's simply a place where you find your ultimate expression, as I mentioned earlier. And beliefs, to Swedenborg, are helpful in getting us there. But he believed very strongly that beliefs, as I mentioned, are not salvific. So he believed that all religions can lead us into a heavenly life. In fact, in his visions of heaven, all religions are represented. There's a diversity of religions. There's a diversity of all kinds of even religious practices in heaven, because once again, he focuses not on the outward things but on the inward things, and he has a very clear belief that, well, if you don't if you don't buy into this, that's fine. As you mentioned, if you just live a life that is based on what he would call heavenly qualities, which are all around truth seeking and love seeking and practicing, you're good. You're good, regardless of what your specific religion is. So there's no need to accept, again, the minutia of metaphysical time and space stuff here, because that's really not what it's about. It's about finding our spiritual state that resonates.
Now, what was Swedenborg's initial reaction when he had these revelations, these visions? Was he like, "Oh my God, that's exactly what I thought of," or it's like, "Oh, that scares me. That's radical. I don't know if I want to share this stuff with people."
Yeah, yeah, no, and it was a gradual process for Swedenborg, and we have records, some records of what he was going through, because he actually kept a journal that he did not publish. So we have his what's now published as the Spiritual Diary or Spiritual Experiences, and we have his dream journal, in fact, which is fascinating. So we do have some insight into how he initially engaged with these experiences, and yeah, it was like for most mystics, it was a kind of rapturous and cataclysmic process at first. But he claimed that he was, in some sense, in constant contact with these spiritual entities, and they kind of became a regular part of his life. And so we see this very interesting phenomenon with Swedenborg, who basically continues to write in some sense as he was before that when he was writing about his scientific discoveries, where he's just based, in some sense, is writing a logbook of what he is experiencing in the spiritual world.
So we discussed this in a previous episode, but I want to circle back to it. Why Swedenborg specifically? Why aren't you having these visions, these otherworldly experiences? What am I doing wrong? Why haven't others throughout history had these same exact visions?
Right. I guess I would challenge that those assumptions to begin with. Right, is that many people have had genuine experiences of spiritual realms, and there are a lot of commonalities. In fact, one of the realms in which Swedenborg has been received very well is people who study near-death experiences. In fact, the guy who coined that term, a lot of people who have studied near-death experiences, for example, find that they resonate. So, in a sense, I'm challenging the assumption that this was unique to Swedenborg. And what he would say is that, yeah, we in fact all have an opportunity to connect with these realities. It might not all be the same for us, but it opens a very classic Swedenborgian question of, is this a logbook or is this an instructional manual, right? And I think Swedenborg's answer would be, once again, the important part is the spiritual principles. The important part is not, oh, can I now go ahead and talk to this particular person that's deceased? Swedenborg did do that, and he did claim that that's possible, but that's really not the point. He believed that, in fact, he cautioned against us kind of being too playful or kind of, seeking out experiences just for the sake of experiences. But he would claim that the things that he saw represented by time and space images, by these visions of heaven and hell, are in fact things that we are experiencing now inwardly, whether or not they are manifesting in the same way. So that's a very important part that, opens the question of, how does one communicate with quote unquote spirits? Swedenborg would believe that we are all constantly communicating with spirits, whether we are aware of it or not. And that sort of goes into the whole physical versus spiritual question in general, where he talks about how spirits are in fact not in time and space. In Divine Providence, he writes, since angels and spirits are affections of love and thoughts thence derived, they are consequently not in space and time, but only in the appearance of them. So, in some sense, he would say that everything we are thinking, everything we are doing, everything we are feeling, because we are spiritual beings, is already happening in the spiritual world. So, once again, heaven and hell, or the spiritual world in general, are not places we go to after we die, but rather they are places that we are in right now, and that we are cultivating right now, that we are interacting with right now, and that we then find our place in, again, spiritually speaking, after death.
Yeah, and that reminds me, we already talked about it, so I don't want to double dip, but about how if we're already living our heavenly life or godly life, what have you, then what's the point of even having a afterlife? And I recommend going back to, I believe that was episode 2 as well, to talk about like what that means, because I mean, it blew my mind. Like that was one of those things. It's like, wait, why is there an afterlife anyway?
Hmm. Sure, sure. And once again, I think that's a very valid question. And not everyone believes the metaphysics of Swedenborg's visions and still takes them very seriously at the same time. Um, so yeah, the question is very real. And I think Swedenborg would answer that if you look at this from a time and space kind of quote unquote egoic mindset, right? And you go, I'm going to read this book now, Heaven and Hell, or whatever it would be. And I'm going to now gather information about what happens to me when I die, where will I go, what will it look like, X, Y, and Z, right? He would argue that those are extremely valid questions, just like the question of, well, where will I be tomorrow, right? But that in and of themselves, knowing this stuff, whether it is accurate, metaphysically speaking, or not, is not in and of itself either salvific or spiritually all that important. What matters, what truly matters, is that we live based on the principles of am I living a heavenly, meaning altruistic, loving, truth seeking life right now? Am I living a quote unquote hellish life right now? Meaning in Swedenborg's framework, selfish, destructive, careless towards others. Um, and that's where the rubber hits the road, and that is where um, that is where he very much places the emphasis, right? So it's not your question is very valid, and the truth is, yeah, you can spend your entire life never looking into such things as afterlife metaphysics and what exactly happens. Is there reincarnation? Is there a heaven? Is there a hell? But if you are living according to the principles that are heavenly, you're good. That's really what matters.
Now, would you, as a pastor, be comfortable with telling someone, like, say they came up to your church and were interested in what you had to say, and they were like, you know what, I want to like live a hellish life. Would you feel comfortable telling that person, hey, go for it, party on?
Well, I mean that kind of opens up a whole other realm of morality and ethics and so forth, right? So Swedenborg believed that the only spiritual growth that is actually spiritual growth happens in freedom, right? So ultimately, it is extremely important that we grant each other the liberty of making our own choices, spiritually speaking, and otherwise, right? And then, of course, there's the question of, well, what if you are hurting other people, X, Y, and Z, right? So I certainly, if by hellish one means being destructive towards others and themselves, no, of course I wouldn't give someone advice on how to be hellish. In fact, I would argue that every person um, has the capacity to live a heavenly life. Swedenborg is often quoted as saying, correctly quoted as saying, that living a life that leads to heaven is not as difficult as people think. Meaning that if you are, and again, we kind of talked about this in our last episode too, is that idea that if you really are doing your best, however that looks for you, to be as kind and loving to others and yourself, and as truth seeking as you can be, you're good. You're living a heavenly life. It really is that simple, although it's easier said than done, right?
Yeah. So would it make you a more heavenly person to stop someone from living a more hellish life?
Um, I think that would really depend. I mean, again, we go into a whole realm of philosophy, right? I think that the whole idea of the non-aggression principle, which I think Swedenborg in some ways very much resonates with, would be that we ought to leave each other in freedom to live our choices the way we do, but of course we have a right to prevent harm, right? So, no, me going ahead and telling someone, oh, you shouldn't be thinking a certain way, or you shouldn't be X, Y, and Z, because that's hellish. That wouldn't be appropriate. But for me to say, you know, it's bad to hit other people in the face or to steal from them, those very basic things. I think the question of when is interference justified to me boils back to the non-aggression principle, and I think a lot of people would say that.
Yeah, so say you see someone at a store and they're stealing stuff from there, and would you try to keep that from happening, or would you tell them like, "Hey, man, if that's what you want to do, go for it. Live your best life."
Well, I mean, again, this is a deep philosophical thing. There's a lot of variables here, right? But what again, the non-aggression principle would say that that person is doing harm to another person. Whether it's my role specifically to point that out, I don't know. But Swedenborg is certainly not a moral relativist, right? The notion that we all ought to be in freedom, and we all are in ultimate freedom once we pass on to live exactly how we want, truly. That does not mean that there aren't good and bad, and there aren't consequences to being destructive to other people or to oneself, and very basic. I think a lot of modern notions of ethics, which really, in many cases, go back to the Enlightenment era where when Swedenborg was alive, very much affirmed those basic notions of. And again, to Swedenborg, it really all boils down to: am I being good to people? Am I being nice to people? Am I caring only about myself? Am I caring about others? I think it might be helpful. We've spent a bunch of time talking about how the metaphysics aren't that important, which I think is valid, and I think Swedenborg would agree. But just to do justice to what he's seeing and to that level, which is the time and space based level, it'd probably be good to give a quick little overview of what Swedenborg says happens after we die or while we die.
You read my mind.
Yeah.
Real quick, I just want to give you my interpretation, and then you can
Yeah.
chop it down.
Please.
So you die, however that may look like to you, and then there's this period of, I think was it like a half hour, 3 days, 3 hours, somewhere. You'll correct me. I'm someone screaming at me on the comments, but that's kind of a nebulous area, like where I guess you're basically finding yourself, and then that's where you eventually, I guess, discern of what type of afterlife you want, and then you go be near your loved ones and happily ever after, or you realize like, hey, I'm a selfish person. Let's go to hell. Let's be next to my hellions. What
Yeah.
say you
Yeah.
to
I mean,
that?
no, that's a pretty decent summary on some level. Yes. So I think what you're alluding to there at the beginning is what Swedenborg calls the world of spirits, which is not to be confused with the spiritual world. The spiritual world is just everything that's spiritual. And once again, we are now in the spiritual world as well as the natural world, right? Because we all, he claims, exist as spiritual beings. Right now, we are right now in community with these different realms. We are associating right now with literal spirits in different celestial realms, right? The world of spirits, and this is something that exists in many different traditions, whether, some people have a kind of bardo concept or a purgatory concept as a sort of intermediary state. To Swedenborg, the world of spirits is the spiritual state that we enter right when we die. And it's very similar to what a lot of people actually describe who are having near-death experiences. One of the things he talks about is that a lot of people, when they die, when they are entering that state of the world of spirits, they're not even aware that they died, because it is so much like their regular environment and so forth. And it's all set up to be a kind of perhaps a stabilizing, or whatever it would be. And there is actually no time. Of course, none of these things are limited by time and space, but he does not talk about there being like a time limit or anything, right? But it is a space in which we truly get to self-realize, and in which we truly get to figure out some of those things that maybe we didn't figure out during our earthly life, right? For example, you may have lived an awesome life and been really kind to people, right? But you also believe that there's a wrathful and punishing God, for example, which the latter Swedenborg would say is an inaccurate belief, right? So if he argues that, say you lived a great life, you were really kind, you had the right intentions, sought after truth, came to the conclusion that God is wrathful. You will get a chance in the world of spirits to learn about how God is actually loving, right? And then integrate that into your heavenly life, an opportunity you may not have had during your lifetime because all you were ever told is that God is wrathful, right? So you kind of probably guess what I'm saying is that there's, if we truly want to self-realize and be in the spiritual state that works for us, sometimes we don't get to do that fully in this lifetime. He even talks about how he has visions of, say, infants, for example, right? Infants who die without having had that experience of a prolonged lifetime of cultivating their inner self by means of having an outer experience. He talks about how those kids are then raised in the world of spirits, and given those opportunities to learn, to change, to progress. And then the next state, which Swedenborg describes as heaven and hell. Once again, we kind of have to remove ourselves perhaps from our conditioned concepts of what those are. They're not reward or punishment. In fact, hell is not really a place of suffering either. It's a place of self-centered pleasure. This was one of the things that people really didn't like about Swedenborg on the more traditionalist side, is that he did not believe that hell was a punishment, but that if you really want to live a life of self-centeredness, you do. You get exactly what you want. You don't get to hurt other people unless they really want to be hurt, and that's their life. So that's, if that's your thing, right? But the notion really is that after we have that time of self-reflection, of learning, of discovery, we then choose our own place, our own heavenly society to quote unquote live in, to dwell in. And it is the place that is most suited for us, and it's the place that corresponds to what we love and what we care about. And we all get an opportunity to then live in that state. And and again, there's a subjectivity to it. For example, Swedenborg has these visions, and I love this particular one because it's such a great illustration of sort of the subjectivity of heaven and hell, where he talks about, he has this vision of a place, aka state, that he considers hellish, right? People are being mean, people are being abusive, and so forth. And correspondentially, he's seeing these steams emanating from the ground, these fumes, right? And he hates them. They're gross. But the people who are living in that space, spiritually speaking, love them, and they go towards them and they suck them all up because to them it's pleasurable, And once again, the visions of someone who is in what Swedenborg calls a hellish state, being willing, being allowed to freely enter a heavenly society and just not liking it, So there's that, I think, really beautiful belief of none of us is ever going to be forced to live a life of heaven. We cannot ever be forced to live a heavenly life. There is no such thing as a heavenly life without choice. But he's very clear that we are all designed to go to heaven. None of us are meant to be in anything other than that state of pure wisdom, pure love, pure joy, reunion with the divine. But none of us will ever be forced to.
Now, walk me through the process, or walk me through what Swedenborg said of that
Right.
transition period. You die, you go into the world of spirits, and then you go to heaven or hell. When you transition from the world of spirits to heaven or hell, what does that look like? Do you just know, like, oh, it's clouds and it's angels and stuff, or it's all the bad stuff? And so, is there a whole process behind that?
Right. Well, I think, again, we have to bear in mind that these are time and space illustrations of spiritual realities, right? So it's very hard to say, well, step A, B, C, D, right? But it's a very gradual process. It's a process that really allows us to go through that gradual growth, and it looks different for everybody. Swedenborg actually believed that many of his experiences were taking place, if not the majority, in the world of spirits, as opposed to heaven and hell. And that in the world of spirits, and this is very interesting, one of the things he talks about is there are plays put on for people. There are plays put on for people by spirits and angels disguised as certain historical characters, et cetera, to teach us lessons. Now, that's a very interesting thing to think about when we think about Swedenborg's own experiences, right? For example, Swedenborg claims that in the afterlife, he saw Martin Luther, and that Martin Luther, repented of all of his false ideas and all of that good stuff, or he saw Calvin or he saw Socrates and knows what kind of place they're in. He didn't like Calvin, surprise, surprise. But
Well, why did
but
Kelvin want to see him?
right, right. Don't get me started on that, right? But basically, what he's saying is that there are realms in the spiritual world and in the world of spirits. In fact, everything there is time and space based imagery that illustrates spiritual principles. So is Swedenborg actually talking about the good to quote unquote the ghost of Martin Luther, or is Swedenborg encountering an idea that he's associating with Martin Luther, such as faith alone? Or is he encountering an idea that he associates with Calvin, which is predestination, and so Calvin must be in hell, right? So I think it's really important for us to bear in mind that thing that he constantly hammers into us, which is these are spiritual ideas illustrated by time and space concepts.
Okay, so we talked about the afterlife and what that may look to different people, and you had mentioned, oh, was Calvin, was that just the vision of him or angel version or all that stuff? Does Swedenborg have this all mapped out, like all the nitty gritty details? It's a big book. I mean, he's got to have some of it mapped out.
No, 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 of course not. And a lot of these are uh, refined samples of visions that he had. If you look at the spiritual diary, there's a lot more voluminous experiences and so forth that he talks about. So no, he doesn't have it all mapped out. And the truth is, you mentioned earlier, what does it look like? He believes that our life in the afterlife is as much more complex, actually, and a lot more real than our lives here. So to Swedenborg, heaven, for example, is not a place where you kind of just chill, right? But it is a place in which you continue to live your spiritual life on the spiritual plane in the freedom that that spiritual plane allows you, where you're no longer confined to the time and space realities. But he talks about how, in terms of how it appears to us, is that in heaven, we have a job, we have hobbies, we have things we do, we have landscapes we visit, we have friends, we have sexual partners, X, Y, so it's an extremely vast, more vast space than our limited time and space based. The difference is that we are not limited by the externalities, but we truly get to live a life whose externals correspond directly with what's within us, if that makes any sense.
No, it did. One of the things I also want to know, I mean, because obviously you've written all of Heaven and Hell, and that just
I
terrifies me.
haven't written all of Heaven and Hell.
You
I have
haven't?
read it.
Oh
I've
man, like
read it.
okay, all right. Well,
Uh,
from from what you gathered, was there anything about Heaven and Hell where you're like, oh, I don't know, that didn't age well?
yeah, a lot of it. And that's true for a lot of Swedenborg's works in general. Um, this was written by a European man, right, in the 1700s. And there are a lot of things that are problematic, both in terms of sort of the subjective cultural stuff that society has changed, but also in terms of the metaphysics of this stuff. Um, One of the works of Swedenborg that I'm actually most grateful for is his work, Earth in the Universe, also published as Other Planets, also published as Life on Other Planets, where Swedenborg talks about visiting the spiritual realms corresponding to these planets, and has these encounters with people on Mars and people on Jupiter. And it's one of those things that a lot of Swedenborgians are kind of like, yeah, let's not put that one on the book table. Let's just put heaven and hell and maybe divine love and wisdom on there, right? But I'm extremely grateful for that work because I think it speaks to what you're talking about. It speaks to the challenges that some of these ideas may bring up for us, right? For example, there's probably no people on Jupiter. Sorry to sorry to disappoint.
I
There's
have a
probably no
YouTube video
people
for
on
you.
Mars, right? But I personally am inclined to think that Swedenborg did in fact see those things. He did in fact have those experiences in a very real way, and that just as he says, the spiritual significance of those experiences does not rely on their metaphysical time and space accuracy. So, did Swedenborg believe that he was literally talking to people on Jupiter? Yes, I think he did. But did Swedenborg believe that the benefit of him sharing that experience is for us to now know, oh, there's people on Jupiter and they live like this or like that? No. The spiritual the spiritual significance of what he's seeing, as he's very clear, is that these are time and space based illustrations of spiritual realities which exist within us. And if you look at a lot of traditions within mysticism, and especially within the Western esoteric tradition, this is not a unique idea. The notion that the divine and ultimate reality and spiritual reality expresses itself to us by means of imagery, by means of quote unquote divine plays. That's how Swedenborg interprets scripture. It says, well, this is not, now we know, the earth was created in 7 days, 6 days, X, Y, and Z, this many years. No, it's that, not that doesn't matter, right? But the treasure is in the inner, in the sense that the creation of the earth, for example, corresponds to an inner process that occurs within us, right? So that's very much true for well, pretty much everything he writes in these experiences. He writes in TCR 25, the spiritual world does not possess material space and time corresponding to it, but there appear to be space and time there. The appearances answering to the differences of state affecting the minds of spirits and angels there. So you kind of get what I'm getting at there is that in that realm, or in other words, the significance and the truthfulness of a statement does not rely on its time and space based accuracy, although those are important and relevant, but on their spiritual significance.
Okay, well, I want to start winding down and
Yeah.
do like a little bonus round where we just go boom, boom, boom. Before we do that,
Yeah.
is there anything else you want to mention about heaven and hell, whether it be what Swedenborg said or what you personally believe, or something you want to impart upon me and the masses watching on YouTube?
Yeah. I would say my recommendation to everyone watching, to you and to me, as someone who takes this stuff very seriously, would be just read some of the stuff. Read some of this, pick up something by Swedenborg, whether it's afterlife related or not. But let's say that's something you're interested in. Read it and let it speak to you. Let it speak to your natural mind, and let your natural mind process what may or may this mean in terms of time and space based stuff, about in terms of metaphysics, in terms of about what happens to me, quote unquote, me after I die, and also allow your spiritual self to take in and process what you're hearing. This is going to be my last quote of today's show, I believe, and that's Divine Love and Wisdom 69, where he writes, when we know how to raise our minds above images of thought derived from space and time, we pass from darkness into light and taste things spiritual and divine. So my advice would be read this stuff and simply allow yourself to sit with it. Let it speak to you. And then if it makes you a more heavenly person, if it makes you kinder, if it makes you more truth-seeking, it's achieved its purpose.
Well, hopefully it doesn't make you an angrier person.
And it may. And if it does, then it is leading you in a quote unquote hellish direction, because once again, it's not the externals that matter. You can know or believe all kinds of things about what happens after death if you're not incorporating heavenly ideas, principle, heavenly living, ethical living into your life. It's that knowledge is of no use, argues Swedenborg.
That sounds like it's going to be it for now. I have like so many questions and we can go into all kinds of different paths.
Yep.
So thank you for your flexibility. Thank you for thinking on your toes. And let's drive this baby home. Like I said, what do you have for final thoughts?
My final thought would be read Swedenborg. Figure it out yourself. Listen to your intuition. Listen to the still small voice within.
Yeah, and we discussed you can find a lot of the works, all the works, right, at Swedenborg Library?
Right. So if you are looking for works by Swedenborg, the best place to go is swedenborg.com. Swedenborg.org is the Swedenborgian Church of North America. Swedenborg.com is the Swedenborg Foundation, which is an independent publisher. They have most of Swedenborg's published theological works as free PDFs on there, in addition to paperbacks and so forth that you can actually physically purchase. But most of the published theological works by Swedenborg you can actually find completely for free on Swedenborg.com and elsewhere.
Awesome. And where can people follow Our Lady Bread, Spiritual Questers?
Go to spiritualquesters.org. Connect with us if you would like to be included in our newsletter. Follow us on Facebook. Follow us on YouTube. Engage with our content. And the wonderful algorithms will probably do their job as well.
Good. Is there algorithm gods in heaven and hell?
Yes.
Awesome. I'm Rudy Caceres. This is the good Reverend Thom Muller. This has been Swedenborg Room, episode 4. We will see you again for episode 5 sooner rather than later. Sign us off, Thom.
Bye, everyone. Many blessings. I hope you stay tuned for much more to come.